There was a time when the Mafia wasn't just a criminal empire, it was the invisible hand that pulled the strings of America. From coast to coast, the mob ran the streets, owned politicians, and decided who lived and who vanished without a trace. Welcome to the Gangland History Podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Stoops, bringing you history with a body count. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Gangland History Podcast. I'm your host, mob historian and podcaster, Jacob Stoops. Today, we've got another great show in which we conclude the State of the Mafia 1967 series. This will be part 3. If you haven't seen them already, I would highly encourage you to go back and watch part 1 and or part 2. As though each episode can stand on its own, they will be a pretty good primer for this episode's content. Now, if you're comfortable jumping into the ride midway or even towards the end, then that is totally fine as well. This episode will contain a ton of meat and potatoes, Cosa Nostra information. Thus far in this series, we've covered a range of topics, including the historical background and existence of Cosa Nostra, the role of the commission, organizational structure, terminology, chain of command, qualifications, admissions to membership, initiation rights, membership obligations, advantages of LCN membership, security measures, and transfers of members. In today's episode, we'll cover administration and known capos of many of the LCN families across the United States, as well as FBI notes on each family's structure and situation as of 1967. Think of this as a great around-the-horn style of episode that gives you the lay of the land of many of the key Cosa Nostra families in the United States as they stood in 1967 during the heyday of the mob. As you'll see, the FBI got some things right, other things wrong, and completely omitted some other pieces of information. The report is organized by city, and once you get past New York, it appears to be more organized towards where they had field offices versus where Cosa Nostra families may have existed. As a result, some areas were left out entirely, while others were extensively covered. But hindsight is 20/20, and we now know more than they knew then, though as you'll see, they knew quite a bit by 1967. This episode will likely be a little more light on storytelling than some of the other biographies, but I can promise you it's straight meat and potatoes information, and we're going to cover a lot of locations. I think you'll enjoy it, so why don't we just cut to the chase? Let's get into the episode. Okay, so let's set the stage here. What you're about to see are essentially snapshots of each family as they stood in 1967. Think of each note as a little temporary window in time with a few tidbits of interesting information. Some notes are going to be pretty extensive, other notes will be a little shorter and straight to the point. Now, as I said off the top, while I won't go so far as to say everything in this report is 100% accurate, considering that the source is the FBI along with many informants, it will get you fairly close to the truth, in my opinion. Furthermore, here's a guarantee that I'll make. You're going to find something or someone in this report that you've never heard about before, and hopefully by uncovering some new information or a new person, that will pique your interest enough to go and do some of your own digging. Hell, I even learned new things myself going through this report. It was fascinating. We'll start in New York City and with the Colombo crime family. Quote, leadership, Colombo family, New York City. Leadership. The leadership of the Colombo family remains the same. Joseph Colombo, boss. Salvatore Mineo, underboss. Benedetto Di Alessandro, consigliere. Vincent Aloy, Capodicina. Simone Andolino, Capodicina. Harry Fontana, Capodicina, Nicholas Forlano, Capodicina, John Francis, Capodicina, Frank Richard Fusco, Capodicina, John Mizuraca, Capodicina, Salvatore Musacchio, Capodicina, John Odo, Capodicina, Carmine Persico Jr., Capodicina, Nicoline Sorrentino, Capodicina, close quote. Now, certainly there will be more commentary and notes on other families. However, let's quickly go down that lineup for the Colombos. In case you weren't counting in what has typically been noted as the smallest of the 5 families, the count was 11 total capos on the FBI's report. That list, though, was inclusive of some of the most legendary figures in the history of the American Mafia, including longtime boss Carmine the Snake Persico. He was just a Capodicina. Shorter-term boss from the early 1970s, Vincent Vinny Aloy. The ever-present and legendary John Sonny Francis, who around this time was convicted of masterminding a series of bank robberies and sentenced to 50 years, a case in which there has been ample evidence over the years to strongly suggest that he was framed. A lot of powerful guys in the Colombo family at that time who were yet to take their proper place in the hierarchy. Next, we move on to the Bonanno Crime Family. You'll certainly notice that the Bonanno section will be a bit longer, actually much longer, as this note is right in the middle of the transition of power away from family namesake Joe Bonanno to the rival faction within the family, which has often been referred to as the Banana Wars or the Banana Split in the decades after. Promise you, it was bananas, but in the bad sort of way. Quote, Di Gregorio, Bonanno family, leadership. Since the alleged abduction of Joseph Bonanno from a New York City street on October 21, 1964, the leadership and loyalties of the members of La Cosa Nostra LCN family, known until that date as the Bonanno family, has fluctuated considerably. At about the time of Bonanno's disappearance, Bonanno's brother-in-law, Frank Labruzzo, died August 7, 1966, took over on behalf of Bonanno, either as boss or acting boss, for a few months, according to New York T4. During 1965, New York T22 and New York T7A advised that Gaspar Di Gregorio had been made boss of the former Bonanno family. New York T5 advised on November 23, 1965 and December 1, 1965, that Di Gregorio was having problems because of the various factions in the family and could not settle problems between them. The informant said that Di Gregorio's rise to power in replacing Bonanno was engineered by Steve Magaddino and Thomas Lucchese. They were reportedly manipulating Di Gregorio and his family as pawns. As early as May 1966, NYT-23 advised that attempts were being made to decide what action to take concerning Di Gregorio, who was ill due to heart trouble and who was reportedly being removed as boss and who would possibly be replaced by Joseph Arthur Ziccarelli, with Angelo Caruso to be underboss to Ziccarelli. On May 17, 1966, Joseph Bonanno voluntarily surrendered himself to the court at the Southern District of New York, where he was under indictment on a charge of obstruction of justice. At the present, he is still awaiting trial on that charge. Since that time, this family remains split into at least 2 and probably 3 factions, with one faction remaining loyal to Bonanno. Various individuals have been rumored to be taking over for Di Gregorio, among them Michael Consolo, Santo Sorge, Joseph Arthur Ziccarelli, John Morali, Salvatore Bonanno, Paul Siaka, and Caruso. On August 3rd, 1966, New York T7 advised that a six-man council composed of members of the DiGregorio family then headed the family, and that this action was taken because members of the family felt that DiGregorio was not an active leader, was extremely subdued, and not openly or honestly opposed to Joseph Bonanno. During August 1966, New York T7 advised that Bonanno was desirous of again taking over his family, but expected opposition from Frank Mari. The informant expected, however, that the Bonanno and DiGregorio elements would mend their differences, at least on the surface, and that Bonanno would emerge as the number one figure. On September 26, 1966, New York T3 advised that DiGregorio was still boss and making decisions. However, there was much dissension in the DiGregorio family ranks and that a new successor was expected in the near future. The informant mentioned Joseph Ciccarelli as a possibility, but believed that Ciccarelli did not want the additional aggravation. On September 29, 1966, New York T2 advised that there was still a lot of hard feeling in the family and that many members who are loyal to DiGregorio on the surface were actually backing Bonanno. Informant felt that Bonanno was not out of it yet, and although he was currently stripped of all powers, it was possible that he would wind up as the boss with fewer powers. On October 24, 1966, New York T2 advised that Bonanno was involved in a war of nerves with the Commission, and it was possible that a full-scale war might break out at any time. It appeared that Bonanno did not intend to go along with the decision of the Commission and intended to fight for his rightful position of boss. On November 16, 1966, New York T7 advised that one Patty Shack, possibly Paul Siaka, was being considered as the possible head of the reorganized family, and that followers of Joseph Bonanno who remained loyal to him would come back into the family as soldiers. On January 4th and 16th, 1967, New York T108 advised that based on reliable information received, he understood that DiGregorio had been removed as boss either voluntarily or otherwise. The informant also had learned from the same source to the effect that Joe Bonanno was now leader of that family and had the blessings of Carlo Gambino, end quote. Let's pause there for a moment. First, as you can see, Joe Bonanno, the namesake of the family for 30 plus years by this point, had major issues in the early part of the 1960s and the middle 60s, so much so that he staged his own kidnapping and flew the coop to Canada for over 2 years before coming back to what he in his book would later call the volcano, aka New York. And yes, I do believe he staged his own abduction. I do not believe it was engineered by Stefano Magaddino. As a result, the Bonanno crime family splintered, and Gaspar DiGregorio, Bonanno's longtime friend turned enemy, led the opposing faction. Unfortunately, DiGregorio's weak leadership combined with Bonanno's absence, though he left his son Bill in place, I think that's a punk move, created a massive power vacuum that the Commission, the Mafia's ruling body, was attempting to figure out how to fill, how to deal with it. This was a bad issue for the whole Commission. It really put the Commission and Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese's leadership to the test for the first time since 1957, really to the test. And then when Bonanno returns, this throws everything into chaos again, as he is alleged to have directly challenged and defied the Commission's orders to abdicate his position as boss of the family and get the fuck out of New York and never come back. And forgive the swearing. I don't like to swear, but that's pretty much the edict that they gave him. Get out or you will be killed. I'm amazed that he didn't get killed. But the last part of the note suggests that Carlo Gambino gave his blessing to Bonanno to take back over the family. And this is why I don't think you can fully trust FBI notes. Sometimes the FBI gets it wrong, sometimes they get it right, or sometimes they just have to record information for posterity or simply report the speculation of an informant who may or may not know the truth. And I think that was the case here. I think that the informant truly heard that and dutifully, I guess, reported it back to the FBI agents, who in turn memorialized it in a report. But Hindsight is 2020. Again, I can't believe that that was accurate, that Carlo would give his blessings to Joe Bonanno to take the family back over, considering the amount of strife that they went through and the fact that Joe had openly defied their orders. Now, history will tell us that Gambino and the others on the commission, for all intents and purposes, banished Bonanno to Arizona on threat of death. Bonanno absolutely did not have Carlo Gambino's approval to take the family back over. Why? It's simple. Carlo controlled the commission and had Joe Bonanno there as a youngish boss with 3 decades of experience at the highest level under his belt, right? Bonanno had been boss since 1931. That is a challenge to Carlo's position as the leader, and in most cases, especially here, I know it's meant to be shared power, but really there can only be one alpha, and Carlo was the alpha. Joe wanted to be the alpha, and it just was not gonna work. This was simply a case of 2 alphas challenging each other for dominance, in my opinion, and Carlo got the upper hand. Frankly, I'm shocked, again, that Bonanno was not killed. In any event, the report goes on to show just how messy things truly were within this family at this time. It was pretty much a rudderless ship as different factions jockeyed for position, and the commission would have to act. Quote, on February 1st, 1967, New York T23 advised that he had learned that Bonanno was trying to regain his former position as boss of his former LCN family and wanted Joseph Ziccarelli to stay on as underboss. Bonanno was reportedly seeking Ziccarelli's support in his bid to regain control. On February 1st, 1967, New York T3 advised that Salvatore Bonanno was now considered boss of the family and was calling the shots, with Joe Bonanno acting in an advisory position. Information from New York T7 and later from New York T3 indicated that Salvatore Bonanno was recognized as the leader of the Bonanno faction, which was in dispute with those who had followed Di Gregorio. On February 16, 1967, New York T7 advised that in the reorganization, the following appeared to be set up. Boss, Joseph Ziccarelli. Underboss, Angelo Caruso. Consigliere, Salvatore Bonanno. Capo Regime, Frank Mari. On February 28, 1967, New York T23 advised that he had learned that Di Gregorio had stepped down as boss and that Ziccarelli had been elevated to the position of boss. He said that Joe Bonanno has been a headache to the LCN family for a long time and that many members of the Bonanno family want Bonanno to be killed. However, Bonanno was believed to feel secure against any such action because Ziccarelli would not do Bonanno any harm. During March 1967, New York T7 advised that peace between the Bonanno and Di Gregorio groups would probably be years in the making and that Joe Bonanno was traveling on high and was not concerned about any interference from other New York families. This informant advised that at that time there appeared to be 3 factions involved in representing the family, including Joe Bonanno and Ziccarelli. On April 6, 1967, New York T12 advised that he had learned from a reliable source that Joseph Bonanno was still attempting to regain power in LCN, which he had prior to his disappearance in 1964, so that Salvatore Bonanno, his son, can eventually take over the family. However, Joe Bonanno was attempting to have this sanctioned by members of the commission, but was running into opposition as some of the higher-ups do not recognize Bonanno or the former members of his family. End quote. Now, I promise we're nearing the end of the Bonanno section, but if you're like me, I think you would agree that these reports are very, very interesting at the least. Now, let's take this part of the report on home. Quote, New York T12 advised that the old-time LCN members in the former Bonanno family felt they could not accept Salvatore Bonanno as their boss due to his immaturity and lack of experience. The LCN members in the former Bonanno family in New York City were extremely nervous and unsettled and would not make a move until the power play or control has been resolved. Further, according to New York T12, Joe Bonanno was fearful that someone would kill him before he has been able to make arrangements for Salvatore Bonanno to take over the family. On May 23, 1967, New York T7 advised that during the previous week, the reorganization of the family was reportedly straightened out, with Paul Shack as boss and Joe Ziccarelli as underboss. Salvatore Bonanno was coming back into the family as a soldier. However, the informant said the situation had blown up again because all of the brass involved were not 100% behind Paul Shack. On June 7th, 1967, New York T23 advised that Angelo Caruso had been made boss of this family. Joseph Ziccarelli had been made underboss in New Jersey, and Vito Di Filippo had been made underboss in New York City. The informant said that Paul Siaka had been placed on the board but did not elaborate on the meaning of this. The informant advised that Salvatore Bonanno has not been accepting LCN discipline and that he and his close associates, who are younger and more belligerent than the old-timers who are in charge, have been a cause for concern for these old-timers. Some of the blame for this has been charged to Ziccarelli and Sam DiCavalcante, since they pled Bonanno's case at a time when the LCN felt that the Bonannos should have been eliminated. On June 15, 1967, New York T23 advised that the leadership structure had again been changed and that Paul Siaka has been placed in charge on a temporary basis until a decision can be made. According to this source, Ziccarelli had been dropped as underboss and was without a position of leadership. The decision regarding the boss would be made by representatives from 5 families and would be a binding one. The source reiterated that the problem lies in the fact that Joseph Bonanno is unwilling to step aside gracefully and still hopes to regain his old power and position. On July 7, 1967, New York T2 advised that the current situation within this family is a powder keg and that the vast majority of the family members do not actually know what is going on, and those few who do know are afraid to discuss the matter with other members. As far as this informant knew, Gaspar Di Gregorio was still the boss, although he did not seem to have the backing of the membership. Further, Joe Bonanno was still trying to become boss again. On August 8, 1967, New York T3 advised that Paul Siaka was still attempting to obtain control of the family and was receiving support from Joseph Colombo. The informant said that due to mutual distrust, the Siaka and Bonanno factions have been unable to meet and settle their differences. The informant said that Siaka definitely wants to be boss and that as a result, very little can be accomplished between Bonanno and Siaka in the way of compromise. Close quote. Now, I promise we're almost done with the Bonanno section, but again, just based on the volume of conflicting reports, I think you can see the amount of static and uncertainty that existed within the family at this time. I'm really shocked. Frankly, I just can't understand how a full-scale war didn't break out given the time frame that we're in. I'm surprised that the families just didn't go to the mattresses. And you got to give Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese a little bit of credit for holding it together, and the members of the family for holding it together, because a full-scale war at this time, I think it would have been really, really bad for Cosa Nostra on a national level. Now, one last time back to the Bonanno situation. Quote, on August 14th, 1967, New York T-179 advised that Joe Bonanno has retaken his former position as head of the family. He said that during the problems which arose with Bonanno, some members of that family were taken into the Carlo Gambino family. However, these individuals have been restored under the authority of Bonanno. Informant advised that a war was about to start in New York City over control of LCN. However, he was not completely convinced over this situation. On September 4th, 1967, informant advised that a series of conferences were held in the New York City area during the week of August 30th, 1967, with representatives mainly from the Bonanno, Lucchese, and Gambino families. The main purpose related to the Bonanno situation. All were advised that Bonanno had lost out in the power struggle, and it was the unanimous agreement of the other family heads that Bonanno is through, and that he and his son Salvatore Bonanno are to be killed. The informant further described Bonanno as having gone completely crazy and is unmanageable. Also, as a result of the above meetings, the remaining members of the family will be assimilated into the Gambino family, or the Bonanno family will be taken over by one of several candidates, the most prominent being Carmine Tramunti. On September 14th, 1967, this informant advised that there will be a call out in the near future for members of this family to have a meeting and decide finally if the Bonanno family members still affiliated with this family wish to switch membership to the Gambino family, Lucchese family, or retire. During the past year, the following members and suspected members of this family have been closely allied with the Joseph Bonanno group: Joseph Bonanno, Salvatore Vincent Bonanno, Peter Joseph Notaro, Vito Di Filippo, Carl Buddy Samari, Patrick Di Filippo, Angelo Lappi, Sam Perrone. Also, Peter Joseph Magadino, who was formerly a member of the Magadino family from Buffalo, New York, is a constant companion of Salvatore Vincent Bonanno. Set forth below are the identities of the persons believed to carry the authority of Capodicina or higher, but in view of the disruption in the leadership of the family and the fluctuation of their respective status, their rank is not known. Also, other than the above list of those allied with Joseph Bonanno, they are not being designated by loyalty to one faction or another. They are as follows: name, position, Joseph Bonanno, boss; Gaspare Di Gregorio, former boss, current status unknown; Paul Siaka, was consigliere, maybe acting boss; Angelo Caruso, possibly consigliere; Salvatore Vincent Bonanno, possibly consigliere; Peter Crociata, former underboss, current status unknown; Vito Di Filippo, possibly underboss; Joseph Ciccarelli, New Jersey, possibly underboss; Michael Adamo, Capodicina; Nick Alfano, Newark, Capodicina; Charles Joseph Battaglia, Tucson, Arizona, Capodicina; Michael Joseph Consolo, Capodicina; Gaetano D'Angelo, Capodicina; Joseph Di Filippi, Capodicina; John Fiordolino, Capodicina; Patsy Gigante, Capodicina, acting; Frank Mari, Capodicina; John Joseph Morali, Capodicina; Armando Palestrino, Capodicina; Philip Ristelli, Capodicina; Dominic Sabella, 84 Adams Street, East Rockaway, Long Island, New York, Capodicina; Mike Sabella, Capodicina; Sereno Tardamella, Capodicina; Frank Tardamella, Capodicina. End quote. Okay, so that was a long update. I won't linger here because there is so much more to get to, and the Bonanno situation is worth an entire episode in itself. And just one correction: Carmine Tramunti, who they referenced earlier in the report, was not a member of the Bonanno family. He was a Lucchese family member. We'll get to him in a little bit, but that's where we'll leave it. A story for another day. All right, let's move on to the Gambino crime family, who, of course, by this point were probably both the largest and most influential borgata, not just in New York City, but nationally at this point in time. You're about to hear some very interesting information regarding the changeover in leadership from the regime who supported family boss Carlo Gambino after the 1957 assassination of former boss Albert Anastasia to a new regime, one which would become legendary. Quote, Carlo Gambino family leadership. New York T25 advised that in February 1967, it was decided that Carlo Gambino would remain as boss of the Gambino family, but due to increased pressures by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and other law enforcement agencies on Gambino, Paul C. Castellano was acting boss for Carlo in all matters. Aniello Della Croce was appointed underboss in this family. Joseph Gallo was appointed acting consigliere for the family due to the illness and lack of mobility on the part of Joseph Riccobono. Also, according to New York T25, due to the fact that Joseph Gennaro regime was so big, it was broken into two regimes. Approximately half of the regime, mostly those living in Brooklyn, New York, was placed under a new Capodicina, James Faillia. The remainder stayed in the regime of Joseph Gennaro. The leadership is as follows: Carlo Gambino, boss; Paul C. Castellano, acting boss; Aniello Della Croce, underboss; Joseph Riccobono, consigliere; Joseph Gallo, acting consigliere; David Amadeo, Capodicina; Dominic Arcuri, Capodicina; Joseph Colozzo, Capodicina; Pasquale Conti, Capodicina; Calogero Lelio Di Carlo, Capodicina; Charles Dangara, Capodicina; James Vincent Eppolito, Capodicina; James Faillia, Capodicina; Peter Joseph Ferrara, Capodicina; Joseph Gambino, brother of Carlo, Capodicina; Paolo Gambino, brother of Carl, Capodicina; Joseph Gennaro, Capodicina; Angelo Massia, Capodicina; Joseph Paterno, Capodicina; Gaetano Russo, Capodicina; Anthony M. Scotto, Capodicina; Anthony Joseph Sedato, Capodicina; Joseph Albert Silisi, Capodicina; Peter Stincone, Capodicina; Giuseppe Traina, Capodicina; Ettore Zappi, Capodicina; Joseph Zingaro, Capodicina. End quote. Okay, so that's a ton to unpack. As you can see, the Gambinos were a very large family, and in 1967, their leadership was in a state of flux, with Carlo Gambino appointing 3 new men to the family's administration. So let's start at the beginning. This report suggests that Paul Castellano took over as acting boss of the family in 1967 or in 1966, around this time frame, which is something I've seen in my prior research, but not something that I believe is widely known. I think most people believe that Paul truly took over in the boss capacity when Carlo died in 1976. This makes Castellano's selection as the next boss of the family when Don Carlo passed away in 1976 make a lot more sense. It was not just nepotism. Not only was Castellano related by blood, he was already extremely powerful and rich in his own respect by 1967, and by 1976, he had essentially run the Gambino family for 8, 9, 10 years. While some within the family and content creators like myself may have opined for Neil Della Croce to get the position, it's hard to argue that Castellano wasn't himself highly qualified. He was by that point. Speaking of Neil Della Croce, you don't often see notes specifically saying when he was appointed as underboss of the family. This shows that there was a period of time after the assassination of Albert Anastasio where Della Croce was just a capo regime and didn't get that position in 1957 as a way to keep him happy after his mentor was assassinated, right? So he doesn't immediately become underboss. Carlo doesn't immediately appoint him as underboss, and I think that that's a misconception as well. It appears that Della Croce truly moved into the underboss position in 1966 or 1967, replacing the previous underboss, Joseph Biondo, who'd be noted in other reports at this time as having fallen out of favor with Carlo Gambino and who passed away in 1966. Now, Wikipedia will tell you that Neil got the underboss position in 1965, but I have not, as of yet, seen any documentation suggesting anything other than the change occurring in 1966 or 67, right? So, again, that's why you can't rely on Wikipedia as a primary source. You have to back it up and validate it with many sources and actual field reports. Regarding the rest of the report on the state of the Gambinos, if you weren't keeping count, let me help you out. Again, the FBI notated 22 capos, and within that list were many names of lesser-known figures who I'd classify as sleepers, who even the hardcore mob enthusiasts may struggle to recognize, myself included. These are truly the crews that make the family run. Many crews and many capos are largely unknown by the public. Now, among the notables were Pasquale Patsy Conti and new capo at the time, James Jimmy Brown Failure, both of whom would become stalwarts of the family, rich and stalwarts, and would become a lot more well known during the John Gotti era. There was also Charles Charlie Brush Dungara, who was alleged to have been directly involved in the Albert Anastasia hit. This fact has been confirmed in paperwork as well as by guys like Michael DiLeonardo, who would have been in a position to know. And then there was Anthony Scotto, who controlled the Brooklyn waterfront for many years as the head of the ILA, Local 1814. Ironically, Scotto would take over the union from Anthony Tuftoni Anastasio, who died in 1963 of a heart attack and who was in fact the brother of Albert Anastasia. Scotto would become one of the Gambino family's most powerful capos over the years due to his political connections. There were also a few guys I found to be missing, such as Charlie Wagons Fatico, who was John Gotti's capo. Anthony Fat Andy Ruggiano, who was likely a captain by this point, although I'm not sure of the exact timing of his move up to captain. Carmine the Doctor Lombardozzi, who was also a longtime captain in the family, who at times fell in and out of favor. And what I'll say is there's probably more missing that I just didn't call out. And if you notice anyone else missing, let's discuss it in the comments below. But for now, we just need to keep it moving. This episode is about let's keep it moving until the end. Anyhow, I could go on forever, but we've got a lot more to get to. Let's move on to the reports update on the Genovese crime family, the Ivy League of the Mafia. Quote, Genovese family leadership. Gerardo Cattina continues in the position of acting boss of the Genovese family during the absence of Vito Genovese, who is presently incarcerated. Thomas Eboli is considered to be acting underboss. Set forth below is the present administration of the Genovese family. Vito Genovese, incarcerated, boss. Gerardo Cattina, acting boss. Thomas Eboli, acting boss. Michele A. Miranda, consigliere. Vincent Alo, capodicina. Ruggiero Boiardo, capodicina. Antonio Carrillo, capodicina. Angelo De Carlo, capodicina. Peter DeFeo, capodicino. Cosmo Frasca, capodicina. Vincenzo Generoso, capodicina. Michael Joseph Generoso, acting capodicina for Vincenzo Generoso. Pasquale Raphael Eboli, acting capodicina for Thomas Eboli. Thomas Greco, capodicina. Philip Lombardo, acting capodicina. Rosario Mogavero, acting capodicina. Rocco Pellegrino, capodicina. Frank Alphonse Thierry, acting capodicina for Michele A. Miranda. End quote. All right, again. So there's a lot to unpack, so many heavy hitters. First, let's unpack the obvious. The Genovese family at this time was in a state of transition due to the imprisonment of their boss and namesake, Vito Genovese. As a result, there were a lot of people stepping up to fill larger roles and many guys with an acting title. According to this report, there were 14 total official and acting capos. This would put them at the third most crews in New York behind the Gambinos, who, according to the note, had 22, and the Bonannos with 16 crews. The Colombos had 11, and we've yet to really get to the Lucchese family. But again, with the Genovese, you never really know. They were very good, even at this point, at insulating themselves and hiding their true strength or the true leader from the FBI and even other families for a very long time. Pretty much from the time Genovese went to prison in 1959, the FBI had a hard time nailing down exactly who the real boss was. Even with Vincent the Chin Gigante, it took them into the 2000s to get him to admit that he was truly the official boss. And there was a period of time, especially in the 1980s, where they didn't know. They suspected, but they did not know. However, at the time of this report, 1967, I want to point out that it's been alleged that there was a panel of top echelon guys running the family. The four names that are most commonly included in that panel were Gerardo Jerry Catania, Thomas Tommy Ryan Eboli, Michele Big Mike Miranda, and Philip Benny Squint Lombardo. A few key notes, and then we'll move on again. First, when Vito Genovese passed away in 1969, it was said that Jerry Catania became official boss for a short time before going to do a quick prison stint and then retiring to Florida. However, I've also heard many rumors that the true boss of the family was in fact Philip Benny Squint Lombardo, and that rumor was supported by my recent guest Xavier Eboli, the son of Thomas Tommy Ryan Eboli. However, I've also heard many rumors that the true boss of the family was in fact Philip Benny Squint Lombardo, and that rumor was supported by my recent guest, Xavier Eboli, the son of Thomas Tommy Ryan Eboli, who relayed that his uncle Pat, also a made member of the Genovese crime family, was in the room when Vito made Lombardo the family's official boss prior to going away in 1959. Now, I find it curious that Benny Squint was only listed as an acting capo di Cina in the note that I just talked about. If what I just said regarding the position as the official boss was indeed true, then you have to have respect for his ability to be so low-key that he was essentially pegged by the FBI as a soldier, stepping up into an acting captain's role rather than the actual boss of the family. Very good at keeping low-key. And of course, you also have a lot of paperwork showing the ebb and flow of power dynamics between Catania and Eboli in the 1960s, in which sometimes Catania would exert his position, and at other times Eboli would have seemed to have been the dominant figure. Of course, we know that Eboli would become acting boss himself for a short period prior to being murdered in 1972, likely at the behest of some of the men that I just mentioned. And of course, among the list of capos were some notable stalwarts who were much deeper into their careers, like Angelo Gyp DiCarlo or Ruggiero Richie the Boot Boiardo by this point. But you also have guys like Frank Funzi Thierry, who at this time was only an acting capo for Mike Miranda, but who would figure as a powerhouse figure in the family as you got deeper and deeper into the 1970s. Noticeably missing from the group of listed capos would have been Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, who was at one point in time the capo regime of the 116th Street crew that was formerly headed by Philip Benny Squint Lombardo, who, as we know, may or may not have been the boss. So it's very likely that Tony Salerno was stepping up into the role of capo regime of the 116th Street crew. Like I said, the Genovese family was a powerhouse at this time and very good at staying low-key and keeping the true leadership structure hidden, and that continues even to this day. All right, the Genovese report was fascinating stuff, but let's move on to the last but not least in terms of New York City, the Lucchese crime family. Quote, Lucchese family. Leadership. Leadership of the Thomas Lucchese family has been changed since the last report by the death of Thomas Lucchese, boss of the family. The addition of Charles Giampala, Sammy Castaldi, Pipinetti Francipani as members and Thomas Mancuso as a suspected member. Since the last report, Thomas Lucchese died on July 12, 1967 of a brain tumor. A number of sources here indicated that as yet a new leader has not been selected. However, sources advise that Antonio Corallo, Vincent Rao, James Plumeri, Carmine Tramunti, and John Diaguardi are likely candidates. It should be noted, however, most recently, New York T123 advised that Carmine Tramunti heads the family, and New York T99 indicates Antonio Corallo will be the new leader. On the basis of a correlation of all information, it would appear that leadership will eventually rest with Corallo or Tramunti. Stephen LaSala, underboss. Vincent Rao, consigliere. Antonio Corallo, capodicina. Charles Giampola, capodicina. Joseph Lagano, capodicina. Joseph Laratro, capodicina. Joseph Lucchese, capodicina. John Ormento, capodicina. James Plumeri, capodicina. Joseph Rosado, capodicina. Salvatore Anthony Santora, capodicina. Carmine Tramunti, capodicina, end quote. Now, history will tell us that this report would tend to be fairly accurate, except for a few glaring omissions, which I'll point out. First, let's begin with the portion about who would be anointed to the position of new boss of the family. At the time, Antonio Tony Ducks Corallo was on a meteoric rise, and it's been alleged many times by many people that he was the protege of Tommy Lucchese and the handpicked successor. As the report noted, Carmine Mr. Gribbs Tramunti would keep the seat warm for Corallo, who was doing a stint in prison at the time, though he would be arrested himself in 1963 as a result of Operation Shamrock, now known as the French Connection, along with 43 other mobsters, and convicted of financing the huge heroin operation and sentenced to 15 years. There is a lot of evidence, though, to suggest that Tramunti was framed or was only loosely involved and did not deserve the heavy sentence that he received. For you movie lovers, this would be forever immortalized in the 1990 film Goodfellas, when the Paul Cicero character, played by Paul Sorvino, would say the following to Henry Hill, played by Ray Liotta.
He's a good earner, but he's wild, takes too many chances.
No, I know that. I know Jimmy. You think I would take chances like Jimmy?
And Tommy, he's a good kid too, but he's crazy. He's a cowboy. He's got too much to prove.
No, I know.
You gotta watch out for kids like this.
Yeah, I know what they are. I only use them for certain things. Believe
Listen,
me, you don't have
I
to
ain't
worry.
gonna get fucked like Gribbs. You understand? Gribbs is 70 years old and the fucking guy's gonna die in prison. I don't need that. So I'm warning everybody. Everybody. Could be my son, could be anybody. Gribbs got 20 years just for saying hello to some fucker who was sneaking behind his back selling junk. I don't need that. Ain't gonna happen to me. You understand?
Uh-huh.
Speaking of Paul Cicero, let's get to the glaring omissions from the Lucchese section of the report. First and foremost, I think most of us know that Paul Cicero from Goodfellas was based on real-life powerhouse Paul Vario. By this point in time, Paul Vario was running one of the most significant crews in the Lucchese family, a crew which included his brothers and fellow made men, Tutti Vario, as well as associates like Jimmy the Gent Burke, and later both Tommy DeSimone and, of course, Henry Hill. Vario managed most of his crew's criminal enterprises from his junkyard in Canarsie, overseeing activities such as hijackings, loan sharking, bookmaking, and fencing stolen goods. His crew played a significant role in hijacking cargo shipments and extorting shippers and airlines at the JFK airport in Queens in exchange for labor peace. Additionally, Vario controlled numerous loan sharking and bookmaking operations across Brooklyn, Queens, and Long Island. Now, by this point, Vario was a pretty big deal within the family and had close ties to several key figures, including Johnny Dio Diaguardi, so I'm actually very surprised that he didn't make the FBI's list. Also surprisingly, not making the list were guys like Joseph Jobeck di Palermo, who ran many of the Lucchese family's drug operations and who, frankly, was one of the largest heroin traffickers in the history of the United States, let alone just the mob. Although I might be wrong, I believe he most certainly would have been a captain by this point. So, again, just a bit of a miss in the report. That said, the FBI was on the outside looking in, doing their best to piece together information. So my critical, quote, hindsight is 2020 analysis is not really criticism, but just pointing out things that personally surprised me given what I know now. Equally surprising to me in all of these lists were the many names of capos who I didn't know and in some cases hadn't even heard of. These are the types of guys, like I said earlier, that truly make the families run and who seemingly stayed low-key enough within the family's middle management to go largely unnoticed by content creators like myself as well as the FBI. If any of you know the history of some of the lesser known names within the reports, please by all means leave these comments via YouTube or even Spotify, which allows comments now. All right, let's begin to get out of New York City. We've got a lot of regional updates, and I think you're going to see that there was a ton of activity outside the main hub of New York City, maybe even in some cities that you might not have realized. Now, let's travel to Albany, the capital of New York, and also the oldest city in New York with a current population of approximately 101,228 people as of 2020. Let's get to the report. Quick note, we're going to move quickly for some of these cities to get to the meat and potatoes without all my preamble. We can discuss it in the comments section if you feel the FBI had certain things right or wrong, but I'm going to try to move pretty quickly. Here we go. Quote, Albany, leadership. On numerous occasions in the past, New York T28 and New York T32 have furnished voluminous information regarding the existence of the Gambino family under Stefano Gambino of Buffalo and Niagara Falls, New York. Among those known to have met frequently with Gambino are Anthony DiStefano, Fulton, New York; Joseph Falcone, Utica, New York; Rosario Mancuso, Utica, New York; Sam Grillo, Utica, New York. All of the above are described as subservient to Gambino's wishes, instructions, and decisions. In August 1965, a New York T29 advised that Salvatore Falcone, who now resides in Miami, Florida, but formerly resided in Utica, New York, is the undisputed boss of the Utica family. New York T29 stated that although Salvatore Falcone resides in Miami, Florida, he still retains the leadership in spite of his absence. Informants stated that Joseph Falcone, Salvatore Falcone's brother, is second in command at Utica, New York. New York T29 stated that he was convinced that the Utica group of LCN is a separate and distinct family under Salvatore and Joseph Falcone. This group as a whole is subservient to and under the direction of Steve Gambino of Buffalo, New York. From information furnished by New York T32 and New York T28, Anthony DiStefano is clearly in charge of Syracuse, New York, and is apparently a capodicina in the Gambino family. Joseph Falcone is an identified capodicina of LCN, and it appears that Sam Grillo can best be described as above the status of button man or soldier in the LCN, and possibly as a consigliere. It would appear from information previously furnished by New York T28 and New York T22 that Anthony Guarneri is probably higher than a button man, but his exact status has never been established. His family affiliation is likewise not known, and although it is possible he is in the Gambino family, it appears more likely he is not. End quote. Now, there was so much to unpack there, but I want to move fast through some of these areas, so I'll just say that I find it fascinating how some of the smaller cities can have their own families, which seem to be, in some cases, distinct and separate, and in other cases, they simply act as sub-factions of the larger families from the bigger cities. It's fun to try to figure out, and it's certainly interesting to read these reports later, knowing the FBI was trying to figure this information out on the spot with far fewer resources than we have at our disposal today. Sometimes I wonder, how they actually figured this stuff out. I plan to do an episode on Albany and the influence of the Falcone brothers, who were very powerful within their little sphere of influence for a time. Also in this case, what is not mentioned, though I'm sure we'll get to it eventually, is of course the Joseph Barbara connection, though he was long dead by the time of this report, as well as that of the Bonanno Crime Family of Northeastern Pennsylvania. Anthony Gov Guarneri was mentioned several times in the Joseph Barbara episode as a key LCN figure and close friend or possibly member of Barbara's reputed LCN family, and I've actually had several guests since that episode was released reach out to tell me stories about Gov Guarneri. It seems he truly was an enigma, but he had an impact to those local to the area for sure. Now, let's move on to Baltimore, Maryland, one of the least talked about cities in the entire mob genre, but one city that had a more significant mob presence than you might expect, stemming from none other than the Gambino crime family. I've only really heard my former guest, Jeff Canarsie of Mob Talk Radio, cover the area of Baltimore in any level of depth, so it's not something you hear a lot in this genre. Quote, Baltimore leadership. New York T25 has advised that Frank Corby is a skipper, Capodicina, and a member of the Carlo Gambino family of LCN. Corby, according to the informant, is in charge of the Baltimore area of LCN. Informant further stated that Corby owns a restaurant known as Corby's and has a group of about 10 men under him. According to New York T31, Luigi Morici is considered as a retired statesman who is treated with respect by the Italian element in the Baltimore area. Frank Corby, according to New York T31, has reportedly taken the position of leadership. In 1965, Corby reportedly made monthly collections of shakedown money from Baltimore numbers operators for Joseph Gallo, LCN member from New York. On the basis of information now available, it is not clear whether Luigi Morici is still the boss of LCN in Baltimore or whether he has relinquished this position to Frank Corby. On June 13, 1966, New York T124 reported that Luigi Morici, who is commonly called the Old Man in the Italian element in Baltimore, Maryland, was once the head man of an organized group who had a piece of all the crap games operating in Baltimore. The informant did not know if Morici was affiliated with LCN or the Mafia. However, when asked who was running things, Morici said, "I am out. Mr. Corby is in." The informant further stated that the gambling operation in Baltimore is controlled by 3 or 4 persons, Julius Salisbury, Pacey Silbert, and Fifi London, all of whom are Jewish, and that there would be very little interest in this city for any organized group. According to this informant, Frank Corby is the number one man in Baltimore concerning the Italian element engaged in any backing of gambling activities. On August 1st, 1966, New York T25 advised that Luigi Morici is in ill health and very inactive. On June 28, 1967, New York T126 advised that he is unaware of the existence of LCN in Baltimore and feels that he would know about it if such an organization did exist. The informant said that the gambling and other organized vice is controlled in Baltimore by the Jewish element. End quote. Again, Baltimore is certainly a large city with a population of over 565,000 people as of 2023, and it's also a port city, which makes it of some value, but it's not a city commonly associated with the Italian Mafia. So it's interesting to see that Carlo Gambino and his acting consigliere, Joe Gallo, at the time had their tentacles all the way down the eastern seaboard into Baltimore. I think you'll find that this isn't the only city along the coast, and even in Florida and other countries, that the Gambinos had a presence in. Now, with just 10 guys, this is a fairly small crew, but you have to imagine 100 or 200 associates operating in the area under the control of Frank Corby, who, as it appears, had the area on lockdown at that point in time. For those of us that like to research these things, you'll often hear the Corby group referred to as the Corby crime family, though they were a subgroup of the Gambinos. I find it curious that Corby wasn't listed in the Gambino family section, but it seems the report is breaking things down more along geographical lines than with family affiliation in many cases. Next, let's move on to Boston, Massachusetts, home of both a significant Italian and Irish mob presence, but also a situation that was highly fragmented and very volatile at the time. This part of the report was less substantial than I thought it would be given all of the drama happening in and around New England during the 1960s. In any event, we're going to start going through these cities, like I said, much faster as we're only on page 82 of the report, and I'd like it to make it all the way through page 121 today to finish out this series. And this is like a 400-page report, so we're never going to come close to finishing the whole thing, but I want to get pretty far, and we've got a lot of ground to cover. There's going to be a ton of great nuggets, including things that are missing, things the FBI got right, and things that the FBI got wrong, so let's plan to discuss them all in the comments section. Quote, Boston, leadership. On August 18, 1967, New York T35 advised that Raymond L.S. Patriarca is still the boss of the LCN family, which includes Boston, Massachusetts, and vicinity, Rhode Island, and Maine. The informant added that Patriarca has some influence over Worcester and Springfield, Massachusetts areas. However, LCN members in these areas belong to a New York family. These groups are controlled by Sam Kufari. On September 5, 1967, New York T142 stated that Raymond L.S. Patriarca is still the boss of the LCN family in the New England area. The following individuals have been identified as the leaders of the LCN group in the Boston area. Raymond L.S. Patriarca, Providence, Rhode Island, boss. Possibly Joseph Lombardo, Boston, Massachusetts, consigliere. Gennaro J. Angiulo, Boston, Massachusetts, Capodicina. Joseph Anselmo, Arlington, Massachusetts, Capodicina. Michael Rocco, East Boston, Massachusetts, Capodicina. Henry Temaleo, Providence, Rhode Island, Capodicina. Chester Iacone, Worcester, Massachusetts, Capodicina. Salvatore Cufari, Springfield, Massachusetts, Capodicina. End quote. Now, what I do find quite annoying about this report is that they've combined Boston and there is no section specifically for Providence, so that's a bit of a miss. Also, although it may be more timing based, I think they are missing really some important capos in the family, such as Donato Angiulo, Jerry's brother, Ilario Zanino, and guys like Rudy Sciarra. Although, as I said, I could be very wrong on the timing and their positions at this time. Maybe they just weren't promoted yet, but I'm just taking my guess at this point. Not only that, but I think history will show that by this time, Henry Tamaleo was the family's underboss, though around this time, Tamaleo was in the process of being indicted for 2 separate murders, including the 1965 murder of small-time hood Edward Teddy Deegan, which was later proven to be a complete fabrication by the infamous mob rat Joseph the Animal Barbosa, as well as the 1966 murder of Providence bookmaker Willie Marfio. Tamaleo would be one of several men to go to the can for significant stretches, with Henry serving 17 plus years before dying in prison. Pretty sad situation. Now, I know that these were mafia men in some cases and had probably done a lot of damage to society, but nobody deserves, in my opinion, to go to jail for something that they didn't do. And in this case, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Henry, as well as the others, had nothing to do with those murders. A major lawsuit would be filed by the men's families in the early 2000s, citing wrongful convictions, and over $100 million in damages were paid to the remaining men and/or their families. History tells us that when Tamaleo goes to prison, Gennaro Angiulo takes his place as the family's underboss. So this report seems to have gotten both positions a little wrong. Now we move on to one of the oldest and most underrated families in the country, the Gambino Crime Family out of Buffalo, New York. The Buffalo family had tentacles across New York, Pennsylvania, and as you'll see, into Canada as well, but by this point, the family's boss, Stefano Magaddino, often referred to as Steve, had been the leader for 4+ decades and was getting a little long in the tooth, so to speak. Quote, Buffalo, leadership. On August 25, 1967, New York T-111 advised that leadership in LCN is still vested in Steve Magaddino and that Fred Rendasio is next to assume command with his promotion depending on the outcome of legal charges presently pending against him. Informant advised that the present syndicate, or LCN, is made up of former members of the old Joe DiCarlo gang and is currently known as the Magaddino Family. In June 1966, it was reported that approximately 7 months before, Magaddino intended to relinquish his position as LCN boss, and that Joseph Falcone of Utica, New York, and Sam Pieri of Buffalo, New York, were being considered to replace Magaddino. Stefano Magaddino, alleged chairman of the commission, is undisputed boss of the LCN family, which exercises dominant control over LCN members in areas which include Buffalo, Niagara Falls, Utica, Syracuse, and Binghamton, New York, as well as parts of Canada. The following individuals have been identified as leaders of the Magaddino family. Stefano Magaddino, boss and commission member. Fred G. Rendasio, underboss. Vincent A. Scrow, consigliere. Frank Valenti, Rochester, New York, Capodicina. Joseph Falcone, Utica, New York, Capodicina. End quote. Now, if you want to read a good book on the early days of the Buffalo crime family, I'd highly recommend starting with DiCarlo, Buffalo's First Family of Crime, Part 1 and Part 2 by Thomas Hunt and Michael A. Tona, as this shares a really great perspective on the family's origins as the DiCarlo gang and eventual transition to Stefano Magaddino's leadership. Highly recommended reading. At some point, I plan to cover the history of the Buffalo family, as well as guys like Frank Valenti and the Falcones, who were a part of the Magaddinos, but who were the bosses of their respective cities. Okay, moving on to the other major hub for the mob outside of New York, the windy city of Chicago, which I've spent a decent amount of time on in recent episodes. I won't have time to do Chicago justice here, but this period of time, as mentioned in my episode on Paul Ricca, was very turbulent due to the changeover in leadership from Sam Giancana as front boss to other deserving candidates within the family. This report hits on some of that turbulence as well as other interesting tidbits, including Chicago's more relaxed attitude towards allowing non-Italians to become significant players within the organization. Quote, Chicago, leadership, Chicago family. The organizational structure of the Chicago family as it is known today was brought about primarily through the efforts of Anthony Joseph Accardo, who served as boss of the Chicago family for approximately 10 years. In 1956 or 1957, Samuel N. Giancana succeeded Accardo as boss and continues in this capacity at the present time. It is noted that Giancana was incarcerated on June 1, 1965 for contempt of court and was released from this incarceration on May 31, 1966, at which time he voluntarily fled the country and currently remains outside of the United States. During the time of Giancana's incarceration, Sam Tietz Battaglia succeeded Giancana as the acting boss and remained in this capacity until May 9, 1966, at which time he was convicted in connection with a Hobbs Act matter and was remanded to the custody of the Attorney General without bail. From May 1966 until August 1966, the Chicago family operated without any specific individual being designated as boss or as acting boss. Chicago sources indicated that although Fiore Buccieri, Phil Aldericio and Jack Cerrone were considered as successors to this position, no official designation was made, and because of the heat, which is apparently attached to this position, there was a reluctance to accept the responsibility. New York T-190 and New York T-52 advised in August 1967 that the current official leadership of the Chicago family now rests on a temporary basis with Anthony Joseph Accardo and Paul DeLucia, also known as Paul Ricca. It should be noted that Accardo and Ricca have during the past years acted in the capacity of elder statesmen and have on numerous occasions offered advice and counsel concerning the affairs of the Chicago family. It was the opinion of New York T-120 and New York T-52 that because of a lack of leadership, these persons have come out of retirement, and Accardo currently acts as the boss jointly with Ricca, and Ricca is believed to be the commission representative. It is the opinion of many Chicago sources that with Accardo and Ricca currently assuming responsibility for maintaining and operating the Chicago family, Jack Cerrone must assume a new position of stature inasmuch as Cerrone is the protege of these persons and would naturally be called upon by them to assume responsibility in the operation of the family. In addition, the following individuals occupy positions of leadership in the Chicago family: Joseph Aiupa, Capo Regime; Phil Aldericio, Capo Regime; Fiore Fifi Buccieri, Capo Regime; Jack Cerrone, Capo Regime; William Didano, Capo Regime; Frank Laporte, Capo Regime; Ross Prio, Capo Regime. Investigation has indicated that the Chicago LCN family has utilized non-members in positions of authority who could not become a member of LCN because of their ethnic background. Among those who have risen to positions of power and control in vital areas on behalf of the Chicago family are Gus Alex. Phil Aldericio Capo Regime appears subservient to Alex. Ralph Pierce. Leslie Cruz. End quote. Now, if you're wondering where Murray the Camel Humphreys is, well, he passed away in 1965, or he'd be a part of the list of non-Italians in leadership positions as well. Also, the report missed the boat entirely on Marshall Caifano, who doesn't even show up in the Las Vegas section of this report, which I find astounding. Honestly, I was super surprised to see that, given Caifano's stature. He was big time in both Chicago and Vegas at this point in time. As you can see, though, Chicago always kind of did things their own way and had a ton of talent on their bench, so to speak. All of those guys that I mentioned in this report, super, super respected heavy hitters for the Chicago outfit. Time to move on to a more obscure mob-controlled city, which you wouldn't know unless you lived there. When I think of Rockford, Illinois, and I'm being honest here, I think of the Rockford Peaches from A League of Their Own, which is a great movie. It's one of my favorite movies, by the way. But it turns out, similar to other families, there was a crew, if not an entire family, here in Rockford. Quote, Chicago, leadership, Rockford family. Information has previously been furnished indicating the existence of a family in Rockford, Illinois. This family has, for the most part, operated independently of the Chicago family inasmuch as there is no known close control or association existent between the membership of these two families. It was believed that in the past years, members of the Chicago family had attempted to exert influence in connection with the selection of a boss in Rockford. However, these efforts were unsuccessful. According to New York T-48, the current organizational structure existing in Rockford, Illinois is as follows: Joseph Zamuto, boss; Frank J. Buscemi, underboss; Joseph Zito, consigliere; Lawrence Butice, capodicina. End quote. Now, I'll be honest, I had always assumed the Rockford family was a subgroup of the Chicago outfit, so to find out that it really wasn't part of the outfit was surprising to me. Maybe Rockford locals knew this already, but I certainly did not. I also find it perplexing that Chicago couldn't bring them into the fold or bring them to heel. My guess is the issue was too insignificant to go to the National Commission, but damn, this group must have been tough, this Rockford group. Anyone who knows more, let's discuss it in the comments. I always love to learn more, and this is a group that is going to be worth an episode someday, that group being the Gambino Crime Family. Being a North Central Ohio guy, the history of anything Cleveland is one that is near and dear to my heart. I plan to do a series on Cleveland at some point, which has a rich mafia history in its own right, with ties to the original commission, as well as relationships with Detroit, Youngstown, and New York, just to name a few. This family had tentacles all over the country, including Las Vegas, as well as even all the way down in Cuba. Many big-time guys, both Italian and non-Italian, came out of the Cleveland area. Hell, when Hyman Roth mentioned the Lakefield Road Boys in Godfather 2, that was a direct reference to the Mayfield Road Mob out of Cleveland. Pretty iconic, but for a lot of people, that reference probably goes right over their heads. So let's get to it. Quote, leadership. Investigation during the current reporting period has failed to develop any information in the Cleveland division that shows various positions of leadership of individuals in the Cleveland family. It was previously reported that on the occasion, John T. Scalish referred to himself as the Capo Regima. New York T-112 on August 18, 1966 advised that Tommaso Argento, also known as Mr. Tomas of Cleveland, is definitely a member of the Cleveland family, has considerable stature, and is generally referred to as the chief counselor. From the information available to date, the following would be considered as leaders in the Cleveland, Ohio area. John T. Scalish resides Cleveland, Ohio, reported commission member, identified by many sources as head of Cleveland family, and has referred to himself as the Capo Regima. Frank Milano resides Mexico and Las Vegas, Nevada, has been identified by sources as former national head of the Mafia, was at one time head of the Cleveland family of LCN, is in poor health at the present time, and not very active, but still exercises control over Cleveland family activities. Al Polizzi currently resides in Miami, Florida, former head of Cleveland family, not considered active, but is believed to make decisions on matters of major importance related to the Cleveland family. Anthony Milano resides Cleveland, Ohio, is considered elder statesman among the Italian outfit, is in control of all union activities in the Cleveland area, and retains his prominence through his brother, Frank Milano. John DeMarco resides Cleveland, Ohio, attended Appalachian meeting in 1957, and is considered number one man to John T. Scalish. Frank Brancato resides Cleveland, Ohio, and is considered number two man to John T. Scalish. James Licavoli resides Cleveland, Ohio, is cousin to Pete and Yanni Licavoli, reportedly controls gambling in Northeast Ohio, has contract with John T. Scalish, but is believed to be more closely allied with his cousin Pete Licavoli and the Detroit family. End quote. So this report is roughly a decade before all of the Danny Green drama in Cleveland, in which the city became well known for mob-related bombings, being dubbed by the media as Bomb City for a time. Despite the fact that John Scalish called himself a Capo Regima, which I believe was more meaning the leader or the representant, the FBI reporting was accurate in that he was indeed the boss of the family. Scalish had been the Cleveland boss since around the mid-1940s and would continue to lead the family until passing away in 1976. After that point, James Jack White Licavoli would take over the family and get saddled with handling Danny Green, which ultimately would be both of their downfalls. On December 5th, 1977, Licavoli and 7 others were arrested on charges relating to Green's murder. Green had been killed in October of 77, so the turnaround on the arrest was swift. No pun intended, but the Green murder blew up in Licavoli's face. Moving south to Dallas, Texas, the site of the Kennedy assassination, just 4 years prior to this report. I think you're going to find this report interesting, as the Dallas family has traditionally been connected to the Marcello crime family of New Orleans. This report would tend to indicate that other connections may have been in play, though I can't speak to whether the information is 100% accurate or not. I'll let you be the judge. Quote, Dallas, leadership. On November 14, 1957, Joseph Francis Civello, FBI number 1222605, was identified as having been in attendance at a meeting of LCN members in Appalachian, New York. In March 1959, NYT 56 furnished information that there had been an Italian organization in the Dallas area originally under the control of Carlo T. Piranio, and then following Piranio's death in 1930, his brother Joseph T. Piranio became the leader of this Italian organization. At that time, NYT 56 identified Civello as Joseph Piranio's successor to the leadership of the Italian element in Dallas in about 1956, when Piranio committed suicide. In January 1961, NYT 17 identified Civello as the boss in Texas, who was answering directly to Michelino Clemente in New York City. According to NYT 17, Civello had previously answered directly to Albert Anastasia prior to the murder of Anastasia in 1957. On March 25, 1966, New York T-75 identified the boss in Texas as Joe from Dallas. This source had previously advised that Frank D. Simone, boss of the Los Angeles, California Brigade, represented the smaller Western brigades before the commission on those occasions when a Western United States representative was necessary. After such meetings, it was the responsibility of D. Simone to relay the instructions of the commission to the bosses of the other brigades. New York T-75 further stated that in 1964, D. Simone had relayed such instructions to the boss in Texas. New York T-17 has heard Los Angeles underboss refer to Joseph Civello as the boss of the Texas Brigade. Information has also indicated that the Dallas family might be a part of the Vito Genovese family or in some manner answerable to that family. On August 18, 1966, New York T-113 advised that he has learned through a source in Dallas that Ross Musso, born Rosario Musso, has not been active in LCN for several years, however, continues to act in a supervisory capacity. The informant stated he was unable to determine the exact position occupied by Musso in LCN in Dallas. End quote. As I mentioned, I was actually very surprised to see a Genovese, New York connection here instead of a Marcello, New Orleans connection, but it's likely that both families had some sort of relationship with the Dallas family if I had to put my money on it. Dallas is generally a family that doesn't get talked about, and the history of the family is a little hard to figure out. So I'm glad that we got some of that, though I'd like to have learned a little bit more about the size of the Borgata and some of the key players outside of Joe Civello and the Puranos. Now, I did a multi-part series on the mob in Denver that covered both Denver and Pueblo from the early 1900s all the way through the decline of the Italian mob in Denver. Highly recommend checking it out. The Denver and Colorado series were and are to this day some of my most popular episodes. Some of the information from this report is consistent with those episodes. Quote, Denver, leadership. During the past year, NYT 60, NYT 118, and NYT 119 have continued to report that in the Denver area, Clyde George Smaldone and his brother Eugene Smaldone, who is generally known among the hoodlum element as Checkers Smaldone, continue to be recognized by the hoodlum element as the dominant figures in the Smaldone group, who are reportedly in control of bookmaking, gambling, and shylocking activities in the Denver area. Based on investigations, the leadership of this group appears to be as follows. Denver, Colorado, Clyde George Smaldone, suspected LCN member. Eugene Smaldone, also known as Checkers Smaldone, suspected LCN member. Pueblo, Colorado, Charles Vincent Blanda, suspected LCN member. Joseph James Spinuzzi, also known as Scotty Spinuzzi, LCN member. End quote. Again, with Denver, there is always the question of were they truly a part of what we know as Cosa Nostra in the sense of being mafia versus just being the mob, so to speak. Many sources will say that the Pueblo faction was indeed LCN, while the Denver faction was not, but there are reports that I've seen since I did the Colorado episodes that would indicate that the Denver faction may have in fact been inducted into LCN at some point. Maybe they didn't start out that way, but maybe at a certain point in their development, whereas maybe before they resisted induction into Cosa Nostra, maybe they began to embrace it after a certain point in time. There are some reports that would indicate that they went from suspected to initiated members. Let's move on to Detroit, one of the most stable, low-key, and respected families in the country even to this day. The Detroit Mafia is often referred to as the partnership because of the way its leadership and operations were structured, more like a business alliance than a traditional hierarchical crime family. This nickname reflects both the internal dynamics of the group and its long-standing relationships with other criminal and legitimate enterprises. Quote, Detroit leadership. The Detroit family of LCN was established as a single entity many years ago and grew in strength and stature under the guidance and leadership of Joseph Zerilli and his two brothers-in-law, William Black Bill Tocco and Peter Corrado, deceased. The Detroit family exerts a sphere of influence not only in the Detroit, Michigan area, but also in the Toledo area of northern Ohio. The Detroit family is also reported to exercise some influence in the St. Louis, Missouri area. Family members in Detroit are all of Sicilian extraction, but the family or organization has under its control Jewish, Polish, and Syrian hoodlums who have been connected or associated with racket activities in the Detroit area for many years. On June 1, 1966, NYT 62 advised that Joe Zerilli's rule of the Detroit Italian criminal syndicate extends back for almost a 45-year period. This source stated that Zerilli pulled Peter Corrado out of the gutter and he took William Black Bill Tocco out of the Ford Motor Company plant and with the two of them established the closed corporation that the Detroit syndicate is today. Zerilli and Tocco are described by this source as men of few words and that when they make a decision, there is no argument over it. He also mentioned that the two think alike. On March 31, 1967, NYT 120 identified Angelo Melli as a member of the commission. The information indicated that he considered Melli to be more powerful than Zerilli. Melli is on every major decision by the Detroit syndicate. It is noted that Melli has reportedly been ill and lived in semi-retirement for the past several years. On June 9, 1966, New York T61 named the following individuals in the order of their importance in the Mafia according to his judgment. Joe Zerilli, boss. Black Bill Tocco. Angelo Melli. John Priziola. Peter Licavoli. Anthony Zerilli. Jack Tocco. Dominic Corrado, Michael Polizzi, Anthony Giacalone. On April 12, 1967, NYT 132 identified the top members of the Detroit LCN family in order of their importance as follows: Joe Zerilli, William Tocco, John Prizziola, Angelo Mello on equal level. And that must mean Melli. Peter Licavoli, Mike Polizzi, Anthony Giacalone, Michael Rubino, Sam Lucido. End quote. So again, you can see the very non-standard setup and everything save for the boss role, which was given to Zerilli, but the fact is that Zerilli and Black Bill Tocco ran this family as partners for many years in a very similar way to Tony Accardo and Paul Ricca in Chicago. Of that list, Jack Tocco would eventually become boss of the family, and the Giacalone brothers would become significant leaders within the family as well, and of course quite infamous due to their alleged involvement in the disappearance of one James Jimmy Hoffa. Back down to Texas, was there a family or crew in Houston? Surprisingly, it doesn't seem to be the case. Quote, Houston, leadership. No information has been developed indicating the existence of an LCN family or regime within the territory covered by the Houston Division, end quote. Okay then, moving on. What about Indianapolis? Same story. Quote, Indianapolis, leadership. No information has been developed indicating the existence of an LCN family or regime in the Indianapolis area, or has any information been developed concerning any known members of LCN residing therein. End quote. Now, are we going to strike out 3 times in a row? As it turns out, there were some mob figures in Jacksonville connected to the Trafficante organization, as you might expect. Let's talk a little bit about that. NYT 68 has advised on various dates in 1965 and previously that the following are members of LCN responsible to Santo Trafficante Jr. of Miami and Tampa, Florida. Trafficante has been named by NYT 17, NYT 25, and NYT 47 as boss of the LCN family in Tampa, Florida. These members are John Salvatore DiSalvo, FBI number 3543941. Domenico Romanello, FBI number 1351143. End quote. The Kansas City portion of this report was maybe the most disappointing aspect of the entire thing, the entire report. Kansas City has a rich mob history and was at one time one of the most politically corrupt, if not the most corrupt cities in the entire nation. If you want more on the Kansas City mob, I highly recommend reading The Mafia and the Machine, the story of the Kansas City mob by Frank R. Haid. Let's get into the report. Quote, Kansas City leadership. Joseph Nicholas Savella, also known as Nick Savella, FBI number 1114024, boss. Thomas Simone, FBI number 755974, underboss. Carl Angelo DeLuna has been described by NYT 120, NYT 94, NYT 73, NYT 145, NYT 70, and NYT 147 as the heir apparent to Nick Savella's position when Savella steps down. DeLuna has FBI number 4121933. End quote. Of course, I do plan at some point to cover the rich history of the Kansas City Mafia, from Johnny Lacia to the Pendergast Machine, Charles Benaggio, along with the Nick Savella era of the crime family. There's a ton of history there, and it's just as fascinating and full of twists and turns as anywhere else in the country. It really was. This report certainly was right in stating the importance of Carl Tuffy DeLuna, who was most certainly an influential member of the Savella family, though he would ultimately never ascend to the position of boss. I'm also really disappointed that they didn't mention in this report the Las Vegas casino interests of the family and or the connections to Chicago. I know that they were probably aware of it, so it does surprise me that it escaped this report, which so far has tended to be fairly comprehensive. But speaking on disappointing, let's get to the Las Vegas section. I take back what I said about the Kansas City section being the most disappointing. The Las Vegas section is definitely the most disappointing aspect of what has otherwise been a phenomenal report and great around the horn for the high-level summary of every major city in the country and even some of the minor ones in terms of LCN activity. But this part of the report is shockingly sparse. Quote, Las Vegas, leadership. As previously reported, no information has been developed indicating the existence of an LCN family within the Las Vegas area. Las Vegas is thought to be an open territory in that no one family controls the area. Although certain individuals are reported as closely associated with the syndicate or organization, no single source of leadership has been established to date. End quote. Now, given the involvement of Chicago, Kansas City, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Philadelphia, Tampa, as well as the New York families in Las Vegas and possibly others, I was shocked that this part of the report wasn't more robust. I've actually seen other FBI field reports from this era that would indicate the FBI was aware that families were taking points in these casinos as early as 1960. In fact, we just shared one such report in the Paul Ricca Part 2 episode. But it's neither here nor there. In any event, let's head west. In the Mafia, the Los Angeles family has always been considered the great what-if family. By most metrics, when it comes to the population or notoriety over time, the city of Los Angeles is a top 3 to 5 city in the United States, especially if notoriety is your most significant factor. The presence of unions, ports, and according to Google, the second largest population of any city in the United States, it's a mystery why this family never reached the heights like other families around the country. This family had so many things going for it over the years that it's a wonder how this family never truly managed to take advantage and become one of the premier families within the national Cosa Nostra. Quote, Los Angeles, leadership. The position of boss was formerly held by Frank DeSimone. On August 4th, 1967, DeSimone died of natural causes in Los Angeles, California. On August 4th, 1967, New York T77 advised that with the death of Frank DeSimone, the Los Angeles underboss, Niccolo Licata, was presently in charge of the Los Angeles Brigade. According to NYT 77, Licata will remain in charge until a new boss is selected. The following are reported to hold leadership positions in the Los Angeles family of LCN. Tommy Palermo, Consigliere. Angelo Polizzi, Capodicina. Joseph DiPolito, Capodicina. Both NYT 75 and NYT 154 have previously advised that the San Diego, California area is assigned to the Los Angeles family. A Capodicina is in charge of the San Diego LCN group, and this regime is under the boss of the Los Angeles LCN family. The present Capodicina in charge of the San Diego regime is Joseph Adamo. On September 1st, 1967, NYT 155 advised that the Los Angeles family had received instructions from the commission on how they should proceed in selecting a new boss for that family. They were to have a meeting of the administration of the family and choose a successor for the deceased Frank DeSimone. At the meeting, the former underboss Nick Licata was chosen as boss. Thereafter, each member was to be polled individually to determine if they concurred with this decision. The informant advised that all reports were in favor of Licata being the new boss, but on September 15, 1967, the informant advised that the polling of individual members had not yet been completed. Close quote. First, it's really interesting to see how the commission functioned on a national level to give permission and dictate procedures for families around the country to make changes in leadership. Also, I can't imagine being in a position to individually disagree with the selection of a boss. Think of it this way: if your disagreement was found out, you'd be on the chopping block for sure as a threat to that boss if they did get elected. So I'm sure these agreements went right around the table. Nobody wants to get off on the wrong foot with the new boss, especially in this era. Second, I would also add that I found it odd that you didn't see any mention of Jimmy the Weasel Fradiano, but he may not yet have been a capo regime at this time. Now, digging deeper into the report, I found Fradiano associated with the Chicago family, but listed as part of the Modesto, California group of the San Jose family, which is a bit odd. So they definitely got that a little bit, or maybe even a lot, wrong. Third, it should be also noted that Frank the Bomb Bompancero was one of the key leaders for the family down in San Diego in a capo regime within the Los Angeles family by this point in time. I'm not sure if that was missed, coming later in this report. Actually, I know it's not coming later in this report. Or if Joseph Adamo was the capo before Frank the Bomb. Again, a lot of sources will say that Frank Bompancero was a capo by this time. All right, let's fly back across the country to the southernmost point, Miami, Florida. I think you're going to see that Miami was one of the most diverse areas in the entire country when it came to representation of the various LCN families. Quote, Miami leadership. Investigation to date has failed to establish the existence of an LCN family in the Miami area. Like Las Vegas, Nevada, Miami is thought to be an open territory in that no one family controls the area. It is noted, however, that numerous identified LCN members of several families permanently reside in the Miami area. Joseph Valachi, in September and October 1963, testified before the United States Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. He asserted that Miami, Florida, was an open city in that it had no families headquartered there. Valachi indicated that Miami is known as an area where any member of the LCN can go as long as he clears the trip with his boss. NYT 79 has furnished information that Sano Traficante was reported to be the boss of the LCN family in Tampa, Florida. The family allegedly controls LCN matters in the state of Florida. NYT 79 related it was the general policy of the Tampa family to try and avert any LCN trouble in this state because Florida was considered a playground in which a number of families from other areas have an interest. In the following instances, the individuals mentioned are reported to represent their respective families in the Miami area or hold the rank of Capodicina in their respective families. Gambino family, Agostino Amato, Capodicina, Joseph Silisi, Capodicina, Genovese family, Pasquale Era, Lucchese family, Ettore Coco, Capodicina, Cleveland, Ohio family, Stefano Randazzo, Steve Magadino family, Salvatore Falcone. End quote. Now, personally, I can't believe that Trafficante allowed Miami to be so wide open, but there were a ton of heavy hitters down there over the years. By rights, Miami and all of Florida could and maybe should have been on lockdown as Trafficante family territory. However, the reality is that was not the case, and the report does show that this was probably intentional by Santo Trafficante as he tried to be diplomatic with all the mobsters who regularly spent time in Florida. I'd like to think he got his piece of their action, but I can't verify that to be accurate. In fact, I've even seen several reports that guys like Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, Angelo Bruno, and even guys from Detroit held significant sway on LCN activities in Miami, which is just absolutely fascinating to me. Now let's head up north to Wisconsin. Now, when I think of the Mafia, my mind doesn't immediately go to Wisconsin. However, over the years, Milwaukee became a really significant hub of mob activity and has a rich Mafia history. The Milwaukee family had close ties over the years to the Chicago outfit, which led them to be a major player in Las Vegas. What I didn't know prior to reading this report was that there was a fringe group outside of Milwaukee that existed separately. Let's explore. Quote, Milwaukee leadership. As recently as August 29, 1967, NYT 47 advised that there have been no known changes in the positions of so-called officers of the Milwaukee LCN family during the past 1 to 2 years. The officers are as follows: Frank Peter Balistreri, boss; Joseph Caminiti, underboss; Peter Frank Balistreri, brother of Frank Peter; Capodicina, younger members; Joseph Jumina, Capodicina, older members; Vito Sedita, consigliere. Informant not positive, but to the best of his knowledge, Sedita is logical person to hold this position. It is noted that NYT 47 has reported in the past that Frank Peter Balistreri apparently consults with the Chicago family leadership in matters on which he may not make a decision. He is known to be close to Felix Milwaukee Phil Aldericio of the Chicago family. However, NYT 47 also advised that Balistreri seems to exercise practically complete control and leadership of the Milwaukee family. On August 29, 1967, NYT 48 advised that Carlo Caputo is still considered boss of the Madison, Wisconsin LCN family with no other known leadership positions in this small family. End quote. First, it's very interesting to see the close relationship between Felix Milwaukee Phil Aldericio and Frank Balistreri, and now you have a little more insight into how Aldericio was reputed to have come by his nickname due to his time spent in Milwaukee making friends with the right guys, so to speak. Second, I had vaguely heard that there was a family in Madison, Wisconsin, but I'd never seen it brought up in an FBI report before. For those of you that were aware of the Caputo crime family, I'd love to hear more about them in the comments on YouTube or Spotify. Let's discuss for sure. I'd guess I'd always assumed that they were a part of the Balistreri family and hadn't realized that they were actually separate. Or maybe they were a part of the Balistreri family and were a satellite operating in Madison. You tell me. Some of my research has indicated that the Caputo family may have been the smallest crime family in the United States. Again, speaking of cities with a more rich than expected mafia history, we move to New Haven, Connecticut. For those that don't know, New Haven is located on New Haven Harbor on the northern side of the Long Island Sound. It is the home of Yale University and is the third largest city in the state of Connecticut behind Bridgeport and Stamford, with a population of around 135,000 people. What you'll see with New Haven, and frankly many cities in the New England area, is fragmentation and many small subgroups stemming from the larger families in the general vicinity. New England has traditionally had significant representation from New York families, including the Genovese, Colombos, and Gambinos, as well as the Patriarcha family in Boston and Providence, and many areas, including Connecticut and places like Springfield, Massachusetts, have been divided up by those families over time rather than having their own distinct LCN families. This report, while missing things, will kind of show that. Quote, New Haven, leadership. Investigation, including knowledgeable informant sources, has failed to indicate the existence of a LCN family in Connecticut. It appears doubtful if such a family exists, since the leading hoodlums in Connecticut have been found to have their membership roots in families outside of the state of Connecticut. Such members of leadership rank in LCN are Joseph LaSelva, underboss in DeCavalcante family. Michael Puglia, capo regime in DeCavalcante family. End quote. Now, for me in this report, the two obvious misses would have been guys like Salvatore Midrenault Annunziato and Ralph Whitey Tropiano of the Colombo crime family, who controlled mafia operations in New Haven in the 1950s and 1960s. New Haven would become the primary stomping grounds for William the Wild Guy Grasso of the Patriarcha crime family, and while there had been some murder and mayhem, it would be amped up when the Wild Guy came onto the scene. In addition to these guys, there was also Frank Piccolo, a capo operating for the Gambinos over in Bridgeport, Connecticut, so I guess I'd have expected to see him a little more in the report as well. For those interested, I recommend reading No Haven, The Connecticut Mob and the Rise of America's Model City by Paul Bleakley, which features detailed accounts on all of the guys I just mentioned. Riveting book. And now, one of the more legendary mafia cities, the Big Easy, New Orleans. This is the origin point of what we now know as the modern American mafia in the United States. This is where it first gained a foothold, and of course, the family would gain infamy over the years under the leadership of the legendary Carlos Marcello. However, the report itself was far less robust than I'd have expected, but did show how they may have operated slightly different than other families. Quote, New Orleans, leadership. In September 1966, NYT 162 stated that Carlos Marcello is the boss of the Italian criminal organization and that Joseph Marcello, Carlos Marcello's brother, is the next in command or underboss. In 1963, NYT 11 reported that Carlos Marcello was the representado in New Orleans. In January 1967, NYT 163 advised that Vincenzo Campo was mediator for the Marcello Group and that any internal problems arising in the Marcello Group were mediated by Campo. End quote. Now, I was interested to see the role of mediator, which to me functioned in a similar fashion as the consigliere role in most families. Perhaps the roles were just one and the same, or perhaps they are somehow different. Now, at some point, I do plan to do more work on the New Orleans family, but for those listeners more familiar with the family, I'd love to have a discussion in the comments about anything you thought was left out, which in this case seemed like a lot. I would have expected something on the Carollos as well, but we didn't seem to get it. Speaking of fragmented areas, Newark and the larger state of New Jersey may be the most fragmented area in the country when it comes to the number of families operating there. As you're going to see, it must have been hard to be the DeCavalcante crime family when so many families were nosing around in your state and there was very little you could do about it. Let's explore. Quote, Newark leadership. In addition to the DeCavalcante family, some members of the Angelo Bruno, Joseph Colombo, Gaspar Di Gregorio, Carlo Gambino, Vito Genovese, and Thomas Lucchese families also reside in the Newark, New Jersey area. The following individuals have been identified as comprising the leadership of the DeCavalcante family of La Cosa Nostra. Samuel Rizzo DeCavalcante, boss. Joseph La Selva, underboss. Frank Thomas Majuri, underboss. Frank Cucciaro, Capodicina. Paolo Farina, Capodicina. Luis A. Larasso, Capodicina. Joseph Lolordo, Capodicina. Michael Puglia, Capodicina. John Riggi, Capodicina. Leadership, Newark, Angelo Bruno family. The following have been identified as individuals residing in New Jersey who hold positions of leadership in the Angelo Bruno family of La Cosa Nostra. Dominic Oliveto, Capo Regima. Joseph Scafidi, Capo Regima. John James Simone, Capo Regima. Di Gregorio, Bonanno family. Nick Alfano, Capodicina. Joseph Arthur Ziccarelli, underboss. Gambino family. Joe Paterno, Capodicina. Leadership, Newark, Vito Genovese family. The following have been identified as individuals residing in New Jersey who hold positions of leadership in the Vito Genovese family of La Cosa Nostra. Thomas Eboli, New York origin, underboss. Gerardo Catania, acting boss. Ruggiero Boiardo, Capodicina. Angelo DiCarlo, Capodicina. Close quote. First, it's no wonder that Sam DeCavalcante was caught on wiretaps expressing bitterness about the family's standing or lack thereof, and his dislike towards Carlo Gambino in particular. These recordings are worth an entire episode in and of themselves. Second, I was surprised that this report didn't branch farther out into New Jersey, as we know the Bruno crime family had long had a crew in Atlantic City. I think I touched on that earlier. In fact, it was around this time that you had the switchover from Felix Skinny Razor DiTullio, who had passed away of a heart attack in 1966, to his protege and certifiable homicidal maniac, Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo. Though DiTullio was a longtime capo, which means that the position should have been transferred to Scarfo, I'm actually unsure when Scarfo actually officially became a family capo. It's clear that he became the guy in Atlantic City after Skinny Razor died. I just don't know when he got the actual title of capo regime. My assumption is that it wasn't immediate, especially based on this report. However, we do know that he ran the crew in Atlantic City, and he rose the ranks well into the 1970s prior to becoming the Philadelphia family's boss after the murders of Angelo Bruno and Phil Testa in the early part of the 1980s. Speaking of the last places you'd have expected the Italian Mafia to have a presence, let's head to the Omaha, Nebraska FBI office. As you'll find out, despite not having a family, the Omaha office was monitoring a presence in Des Moines, Iowa, which was infiltrated by two different LCN families over the years. Quote, Omaha leadership. On March 23, 1967, NYT 164 advised there is no LCN organization in Iowa or Nebraska. NYT 164 identified Louis Fratto, commonly known as Lou Farrell, Des Moines, Iowa, as a member of LCN for 40 years. NYT 164 advised that Farrell has terminal cancer, and because of ill health and FBI investigations, Farrell is mostly dormant regarding LCN activities and is not now engaged in any illegal activities. On March 23, 1967, NYT 164 advised that with the exception of Lou Farrell, there are no other LCN members in Iowa or Nebraska. He advised, however, that Robert J. Matthews, Omaha, is the personal representative of Nick Savella, leader of the LCN organization in Kansas City, Missouri. He pointed out that Matthews is not an LCN member and never will be, since he is not of Italian descent. Matthews is closely associated with LCN members in Kansas City and does Civella's complete bidding. NYT 164 advised that Matthews would like to get out, but Civella will not let him out. On June 6, 1967, NYT 165 advised Civella's interests in Omaha were formerly looked after by Charles Snooks Hutter, who now controls rackets in Daytona Beach, Florida for Civella. End quote. Now, prior to reading this report, I was familiar with Louis Cockeyed Louie Fratto, commonly known as Lou Farrell. Fratto was said to have replaced Charles Cherry Nose Joy as the Chicago outfit's primary representative in Des Moines, Iowa, and was, in effect, the LCN's boss of that city for many years until his death. Now, I just want to issue a correction from my last couple of episodes on Paul Ricca. I had been pronouncing Cherry Nose Joy's last name as Gio in the American pronunciation, but it does turn out that his name, which is spelled Gioe, is actually pronounced Joy in Italian, so I wanted to issue that correction. Now, what I was not aware of was the Civella family's interests in Iowa and Nebraska, which again just goes to indicate the reach that the Kansas City mob had in their own right at the time. They don't often get the credit they deserve, but Nick Civella and company were more powerful than many people realize. Moving on to the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia. If you've followed this podcast for any length of time, you'll know that I've spent a decent amount of time covering Philadelphia during the Angelo Bruno episodes, as well as the 3 Philadelphia Mob Hits episodes. Suffice it to say, Philadelphia has always been a bit of a powder keg, and geographically speaking is very similar to what the DeCavalcante family has faced in that their territory is very fragmented, and as a result, they were forced to mix and mingle with many different families, including every New York family, and a significant relationship over the years with the Gambino and Genovese families specifically. The DeCavalcante family as well as other families such as the Buffalino family of northeastern Pennsylvania and the LaRocca family of Pittsburgh. So let's get into the Philadelphia family. Quote, Philadelphia, leadership. An analysis of information indicates that 5 distinct LCN families have been active during the period of this report within the territory covered by the Philadelphia division. 2 of these have membership in the area. They are Philadelphia family, upstate Pennsylvania group. The family affiliation of this latter group has not been definitively determined and is explained in later pages. Other families known to have been active in the Philadelphia division area: Samuel Rizzo DeCavalcante family, Vito Genovese family, Carlo Gambino family. The Philadelphia family leadership is as follows: Angelo Bruno, Philadelphia PA, boss, official representative. Ignazio Denaro, Philadelphia PA, underboss. Joseph Rugnetta, Philadelphia PA, consigliere. Joseph Scafidi, Bridgeton, New Jersey, Capodicina. John Simone, Trenton, New Jersey, Capodicina. Nicholas Piccolo, Philadelphia PA, Capodicina. John Capello, Philadelphia PA, Capodicina. Philip Testa, Philadelphia PA, Capodicina. Joseph Lanciano, Philadelphia PA, Capodicina. Peter J. Maggio, Philadelphia PA, Capodicina. Joseph Scilitano, Chester, Pennsylvania, Capodicina. NYT 86 advised that Alfred Ietzi, for reasons of health, resigned from his position as Capodicina and was replaced by Peter J. Maggio, a brother-in-law of Angelo Bruno. NYT 86 also advised that Joseph Lanciano, who had been acting Capodicina while Pasquale Massi was in Italy, has been designated as a Capodicina, and that Massi was removed as the result of an arrest after an incident at the Hot Springs, Arkansas National Park. Massey's conduct outraged other members of the Philadelphia family because of the embarrassment brought on the family. Massey is under indictment for crime on a government reservation, sodomy, and bribery. Close quote. Now, as I said earlier, the thing that I was surprised to see missing here as well in the New Jersey section was the lack of inclusion of Atlantic City, which by this time had transitioned to new leadership after the death of Felix Skinny Razor DiTullio to the guy who would become infamous and legendary in his own right, Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo. But again, perhaps he had not yet been named a capo regime, despite being at this point the primary made guy in Atlantic City, which in 1967 was still a solid decade away from the return of prosperity in casinos. And of course, we kind of covered the Pat Massey situation in the Bruno episodes, so I won't get into detail here. It seems to have been very similar to the Vito Spatafore situation in The Sopranos, except Massey himself was never killed like Vito was in the television series. Now, here's where the report veers off a cliff. It seems that the FBI had absolutely no clue what was going on with the Northeastern Pennsylvania-based Buffalino family, other than the fact that Russell Buffalino himself was in fact an LCN member. Outside of that, as you'll see, they were really throwing spaghetti at the wall with respect to which family Buffalino belonged to and the existence of a family in the Pittston area. However, this is the interesting aspect of the report overall. Hindsight for us is 2020, but for the agents at the time on the ground, so to speak, figuring this stuff out wasn't always easy or straightforward. Quote, Upstate Pennsylvania LCN Group Leadership. NYT 86 advised on September 27, 1966, that he had learned that Russell Buffalino formerly belonged to the family of Frank Costello. Subsequently, Costello's family was taken over by Thomas Lucchese, now deceased. At the present time, Buffalino belongs to the Lucchese family of LCN, as do the other LCN members in the upstate Pennsylvania area. The informant said that Buffalino has been described as a capodicina and is in control of the whole area around Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. He described Buffalino as being almost like a boss. Information also indicates that Philip Medico holds the title of Capodicina. On October 12, 1966, NYT 21 advised that the LCN members in the Wilkes-Barre, Scranton, and Pittston, Pennsylvania area are one family under the control and leadership of Russell A. Buffalino. He said further that the LCN members in the Hazleton, Pennsylvania area are in a different LCN group. An analysis of information developed to date concerning this group of LCN members suggests the possibility that this group may comprise a separate, distinct LCN family with Russell Buffalino as its official representative boss. End quote. Really, it's the beginning of the report that's problematic. The latter part of the report actually is very accurate. And I've seen reports over the last few years that have suggested Russell Buffalino was a member of the Lucchese Borgata, as this one suggested, or the Genovese, or even the Gambinos. But as we now know, the Northeastern Pennsylvania group was in fact their own distinct LCN family, though even that has been debated over the years. I also find the beginning of the report interesting in that saying Tommy Lucchese, the Frank Costello family, which we know as Genovese, was taken over by Tommy Lucchese, who in reality was the head of his own family, the Lucchese family. So boy, they really got it wrong there. My personal opinion, based on my research, is that they truly were their own unique family, that being the Buffalino family. They were in some way tied to the alleged family of Joseph Barbara Sr., who was said to have his own family near the same area, and that perhaps is the Hazleton family being referenced. And both groups had strong ties with the Magadino organization up in Buffalo. Many will say that Barbara was a made member of that organization rather than the Don of his own Borgata. I've heard that plenty of times, and it's really hard to sort out, although my opinion was that he had his own distinct family that was in some way related to both the Buffalino and the Magadino organizations. Additionally, Russell himself was very close to guys in New York, such as Tommy Lucchese, the aforementioned Tommy Lucchese, and Carlo Gambino, often spending a lot of time in the city due to his many business dealings there, specifically in the garment center. Not only that, but it's clear that Buffalino was very tight with Angelo Bruno as well down in Philadelphia. He had connections all over the place. So I can certainly see where the confusion would lie. I think we're all still trying to figure out aspects of the true Buffalino crime family, even to this day. Now, let's go to the place where they say it's a dry heat. I don't care. I don't care how dry it is. It's freaking hot out there. With a population of 1.6 million people as of 2024, Phoenix is the fifth largest city in the United States. However, historically, there has not been much of a mob presence. As you'll see, similar to the way Ohio natives migrate south to Florida or west to Arizona to retire, you'll see a trend of mobsters from other big cities migrating to Arizona in general, in most cases due to exile. That is the case with the 1967 report. Quote, Phoenix leadership. Through continuous contact with NYT 12 and NYT 168, it has been determined that LCN has no formal organization in the state of Arizona. These sources have advised that the membership of LCN is concentrated in the Tucson, Arizona area and are considered members of the family of Joseph Bonanno Sr., Bonanno faction of De Gregorio family. Bonanno continues to maintain a residence in Tucson, which is occupied by his wife Faye and their youngest son Joseph Bonanno Jr. Bonanno himself spends the majority of his time in New York City. NYT 12 and NYT 168 have advised that LCN members in Arizona are linked together in varying degrees by social and business interests. They advised also that any direction which exists for the above members emanates from Charles Joseph Battaglia Jr. of Tucson, Capodichino, who is considered by all as Bonanno's titular representative in Arizona. The informants add further that Bonanno himself offers no leadership to the LCN members in Arizona, adding that his rather infrequent and secretive visits to Tucson are apparently prompted by his personal family problems and legitimate business interests. These informants have also advised that there is considerable confusion and indecision among LCN members in Arizona as to the exact status of Bonanno in LCN. Bonanno's status is explored at length elsewhere in this report. The members are uncertain regarding Bonanno's status and where their loyalties should lie. Also, information has been received that Charles Joseph Battaglia Jr. himself has recently indicated signs of changing his fealty to another LCN family in view of Bonanno's troubles. End quote. Now, other notable mobsters who ended up in Phoenix were, of course, Chicago and Hollywood-connected mobster Willie Byoff, who was hiding in witness protection before being blown up in a car bomb at his Phoenix home during the mid-1950s. There is, of course, the modern-day connection to former Gambino crime family underboss and notable podcaster Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano. After leaving New York when he cooperated, he would end up in Phoenix, where he'd get busted for his part in developing a massive ecstasy ring in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Of course, we know now that he got out in 2017 and 3 years later started his own podcast, which now has over 630,000 subscribers and, of course, millions upon millions of views. As far as I know, he still resides in Phoenix. To me, Pittsburgh is one of the more interesting areas of LCN that almost never gets talked about. Similar to other big cities of the time, Pittsburgh has a fairly rich but low-key history of mob activities despite generally being a smaller family in terms of size. Very rich history. I plan to get a little into the Pittsburgh Borgata in upcoming episodes. Now, as a Cleveland Browns fan, I know, I don't like talking about Pittsburgh unless we're discussing that the Browns are beating them, which really doesn't happen very often. But I'll break my rule here and in future episodes. Quote, Pittsburgh leadership. Investigation conducted by the Pittsburgh division has resulted in the following analysis of leadership of LCN within that division. Sebastian John LaRocca, boss. Frank Amato, underboss. Mike Genovese, position unknown. Genovese is considered to be an heir apparent to LaRocca. He is most usually referred to as LaRocca's top lieutenant. It should be noted that Genovese has never been identified as an organization member by an actual member source. Gabriel Kelly Manarino, designated as the individual in charge of the northern portion of western Pennsylvania, but still below LaRocca in stature and directly responsible to him. Louis Volpe, designated as the individual who dominates racket activity in the Turtle Creek Valley area from his Wilmerding, Pennsylvania location. Designated as a close associate of LaRocca and responsible for the southern counties of western Pennsylvania. Close quote. Now, those first four guys I mentioned were the real power of the Pittsburgh Mafia for probably a total of 80 years between them from beginning to end. And their influence spans much farther than you would think, especially Kelly Manarino, who even had ties down in Cuba. If you've watched my San Jose episodes, you'll know that the Pittsburgh and San Jose families participated several times in the transfers of members between the two Borgatas. That's a connection I would not have anticipated had I not done the research, but the two families were very much connected together. I'll just say it here. John LaRocca is probably going to be my next biography, so expect that to come down the pipe. I've got a good deal of paperwork on him, and I'm kind of excited to talk about him. Additionally, I would also say that Pittsburgh in the early days was just as active as anywhere else, though not much is often discussed in mob circles about the rise of the Mafia in Pittsburgh. We may decide to change that in the near future, as it was absolute murder and mayhem in and around Pittsburgh in the 1920s and 1930s, just like a lot of other places. St. Louis is another city that has an interesting and relatively underground history of LCN activities, but members in this city had connections all over the place, as you'll see. The city was a hub for bootlegging, gambling, and union racketeering, particularly during the Prohibition era and after. Though not as nationally known as New York or Chicago's mobs, the St. Louis outfit was active and violent, especially in the mid-20th century. Let's see what the report had to say about the state of the family in 1967. Quote, St. Louis leadership. NYT 69 and NYT 133 have advised of the existence of a criminal organization in St. Louis, Missouri, consisting of Italian police characters. NYT 69 referred to this as the family, and NYT 133 referred to the group of Italians making up the core of an Italian criminal organization as the syndicate, outfit, or mafia rather than LCN. NYT 133 advised that Anthony Giordano, boss of the St. Louis family, obtains his power and was made head of this family by LCN commission member Joe Zerilli of Detroit. NYT 133 said that any major type decision arising in St. Louis regarding the outfit, Giordano would have to clear with Zerilli before taking any action. If the matter involved an American and was strictly of local nature, Giordano could make the decision himself. Other persons close to Anthony Giordano and who are considered highly placed members of this family according to NYT 133 and NYT 164 and NYT 172 are John Vitale, Joseph Giordano, Ralph Kalecka, John Ferrara, Frank Pisiata, end quote. Now, for many years, Anthony Giordano, or Tony G as he was known, dominated the St. Louis Mafia. In fact, I've had several listeners ask for a biography on Giordano, and I just haven't gotten to it yet. I do apologize. Don't worry, though, it's on my long-term roadmap. I'll get to it as soon as I can. St. Louis, especially given its geographic location smack dab in the middle of the country, was a natural place for a lot of connections between families over the years. In paperwork, I've observed ties between the St. Louis Brigada and the families in Detroit, Cleveland, as well as the East Coast, and additionally directly with Chicago, Kansas City, as well as the family in Colorado. So, they have a bigger footprint than I think most people are aware of, and at some point it will be something that I'd like to cover. Rich history there. San Diego is a city that I recently visited for the first time in my life, though I have some family ties to this beautiful city through my father. Ironically, when I got there, it was raining, which directly contradicts the city's reputation as being 75 and sunny all day, every day. Apparently, it rains in San Diego an average of 41 days a year, which isn't a lot. It's only 11% of the year, so I guess that I'm just unlucky. And speaking of reputation, San Diego is again one of those cities that does not have a reputation as being a haven for the mob. However, the truth is that the city most certainly did have LCN activity. We've already seen it to some degree in this report. Quote, San Diego leadership. New York T 51 and New York T 121 have advised that Frank DeSimone was boss of the Los Angeles Brigade for several years prior to his death on August 4th, 1967. According to New York T 122, the members of this group were recently in the process of selecting a new boss, and that the underboss, Nick Licata, appeared to be the person gathering the most support for appointment or promotion to the position of boss. Joseph Adamo has been identified by the above sources as the capo of the San Diego regime, which is a part of the Los Angeles Brigade. On September 6, 1967, New York T 155 advised that pursuant to instructions from the commission, the officers of the Los Angeles family had a meeting and selected Nick Licata as the new boss. Also pursuant to instructions, all members are being contacted individually to determine if they are in agreement. This is developed further under Los Angeles section of this report. End quote. Now, by this point, and up until his murder in 1977, Frank the Bompancero, was not just the guy down in San Diego, but a major player in the Los Angeles family. According to my research, the Bomp came up in San Diego in the 1920s and eventually met Jack Dragna, the Los Angeles boss, who became his mentor. Bompancero was eventually promoted to a captain in the family under Dragna, according to many sources. That would have been in the 1940s. As you get into the 1970s, Bompancero had friction with new Los Angeles boss, Dominic Brooklier, who had Bompancero murdered on February 10th, 1977. The San Francisco wing of La Cosa Nostra would also most certainly qualify as one of the lesser known and less talked about areas of mafia activity, yet for many decades, it was a hub, albeit not a hugely powerful one. I've done a two-part series on the San Jose family, which I believe started as a satellite crew of the San Francisco family before Onofrio Shortino passed the baton to the boss most commonly associated with the San Jose family, Joseph X. Cerrito. They would, by this report, be two separate and independent families, according to many reports. Prior to the Silicon Valley era that exists today, there was a sizable Italian population in both San Francisco and San Jose, and the two groups seem to collaborate pretty often. You'll see it in the report. Quote, San Francisco leadership. San Francisco Family: James Joseph Lanza, boss. Gaspari Orlando Bill Shortino, underboss. Vincenzo Infusino, Capodicina. San Jose Family: Joseph Cerrito, boss. Philip Octavia Morici, consigliere. Stefano Steve J. Zaccoli, consigliere. Emmanuel Joseph Filia, Capodicina. The death of Charles Carbone, underboss of the San Jose family, on January 4th, 1967, has caused an opening in the official line of this family, and to date, this position has not been filled. Close quote. Now, I've already covered the San Jose family, and perhaps at some point I'll cover the San Francisco family. The two families are perhaps best known nationally for being represented at the infamous 1957 Appalachian Conference. However, if you dig into each area, there are some stories worth uncovering, and at some point we'll spend some time here. While I contend that the San Jose family was probably the weakest LCN family, that doesn't mean that the San Francisco and San Jose groups were non-lethal. There are most certainly some of the typical stories that you'd expect. It just doesn't get talked about very often. Even with that said, I often do get comments from people who grew up in these eras and around these families, and even to this day, there are hushed tones when speaking about it. So perhaps they weren't as weak as some of the information may tend to indicate. Now, this is not the Springfield I would have commonly associated with the Mafia. That would be Springfield, Massachusetts, which I'm surprised is not really covered really at all in this report. It gets kind of a passing mention in the New England section. However, Springfield, Illinois, at one point had even more juice than you'd have expected, and even perhaps their own family. This group seems to have been similar to the group in Rockford, Illinois, and the one up in Madison, Wisconsin. Small, but distinct, and seemingly not a part of any of the larger borgadas. Quote, Springfield, leadership. Investigation conducted to date reflects that the Springfield, Illinois LCN family is loosely knit. Boss, Frank Zito, end quote. Now, for what it's worth, there is some reporting that indicates that Zito was perhaps a powerful capo within the outfit of Chicago. Other reports would suggest he was affiliated more closely with the St. Louis family. There's not a ton of information out there on Zito's family, but he too, like the San Francisco and San Jose families, was caught during the 1957 Appalachian Conference. You don't get to that conference without being an LCN member and without a certain amount of juice, right? That's, that was all bosses, essentially. Where there's smoke, there's fire. So again, this family deserves a future episode. We'll go ahead and end, finally, with one of the most legendary families in the history of the LCN, one that was dominated for many years by the Trafficante combination of Santo Sr. and Santo Jr. In fact, a number of sources indicate this family still exists today, albeit in a significantly smaller capacity than in the glory years. Quote, Tampa, leadership. In September and October 1963, Joseph Valachi, an admitted member of the Vito Genovese family of LCN, testified before the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations of the Committee of Government Operations, United States Senate. In the course of his testimony, Valachi advised that a family of LCN existed in Tampa, Florida. NYT 17, NYT 25, and NYT 79 have identified Santo Trafficante Jr. as the boss of the LCN family in Tampa, Florida. John Mizraca, a resident of St. Petersburg, Florida, is a Capodicina in the Joseph Colombo family of New York City. End quote. Now, the history of organized crime in Tampa and the state of Florida as a whole is a tangled web involving much more than just the Trafficante family. If you're looking for a great read on this family, I would suggest Scott Deitch's book, Cigar City Mafia. The book covers the many groups that eventually amalgamated into the Trafficante crime family and gives a blow-by-blow of one of the most infamous time periods of the family, often referred to as the Era of Blood. As you can imagine, there was lots of murder and mayhem down in the Florida tropics at that point in time. And that's where we'll go ahead and close out this report. It's been one hell of a beast. Let's go to final remarks. After the leadership section, the report itself goes on to list hundreds of members of the LCN nationally, by family and by name, as well as by identifying sources across the country, covering approximately 300 plus pages worth of the report. I won't make you sit through that roll call, but you can check out the report yourself if you want in its entirety. I'll link it in the comments of the video and of the episode on the audio platforms. Once this episode is released, I do plan to offer a bonus episode to Patreon subscribers where the State of the Mafia 1967 parts 1 through 3 have been combined into an epically long full bonus version for those that want to check out this report pretty much end to end. I covered roughly 121 pages of a 400 plus page report through each episode, and of course offered my color commentary, and that's going to add up to probably 4 hours, maybe 5 hours worth of an episode. So if you'd like to support the podcast, please head on over to Patreon and subscribe. If you want, you can become a capo level supporter of the show, which I do much appreciate, and all of which goes back into the show, or you can simply join for free to get access to some of the content that I can't put on YouTube or in other places. All of the content is ad free. If you haven't already subscribed to YouTube, what are you waiting for? We're still a relatively small channel, though we're growing pretty steadily. And there are still many listeners who are finding this podcast for the first time. I interact with those listeners all the time. While I don't produce content as often as other channels, I can promise that my content is some of the most thorough and well-researched historical information being put forth in the genre. At least that's what I'm striving for. In the near future, I do plan to jump back into biographies, as those episodes seem to be the most well-received and attract the most listeners, but I can't promise I won't sprinkle in a few interviews or roundtable discussions here or there. In any event, thank you for watching. Until next time, may your envelopes be heavy and your troubles light.